Hello, everybody. Here's a sound check. Testing 1, 2, 3. Okay, great. Now let's start. Welcome, everybody, to our 4th episode of the Learning Strategy series. And for those who have joined our live stream, feel free to leave any comments and ask any questions at any point, okay? I'll keep an eye on my YouTube comments. All right, so let's recap. Again, in the previous few episodes, I mentioned that I only spent 609 hours and I passed the hardest Japanese test for a foreigner, right? I got 100 out of 118, and that is the exact passing grade, right? So it's the worst mark I can get to pass the exam, but I did pass, and that's a equivalent of Chinese HSK 6. Just to verify my sound. Okay. And that's the only way for me to prove that I can get from HSK 4 to 6 because I'm Chinese, right? Taking the HSK doesn't really prove anything. So I did it for Japanese and I spent 609 hours and I passed. And I didn't stop there, right? After 609 hours, I passed the N1 test. But after the N1 test from December 1st last year to today, April 24th, 2025, I actually spent an additional 566.06 hours, which is that's an interesting number. I actually try to keep track of my hours as accurately as I can. So up to now, I have spent a total of this number, 1,610 hours studying Japanese in total. So I'm supposed to be 50% better than how I was taking the test. So hopefully, if I take the test right now, I'll get a better result. But my goal is to spend 3,000 hours on Japanese before the end of this year, before December 1st this year, to take a second attempt. Hopefully, I can get a much better score. Right? If you have any questions, please leave a comment in the comment section. So to answer a question from a user for the last live stream, the comment was, you don't define the terms you use very concretely, inferring grammatical structures through induction as opposed to learning and then applying them seems to be exact the same juxtaposition you mentioned when comparing acquisition and learning. So is input-focused learning not learning, but instead synonymous with acquisition? How can you learn something without acquiring what you've learned? Right. So he's saying that I should clarify these concepts and clarify any potential confusion. So in the last live stream, I mentioned for grammar learning, there's the output-focused approach and the input-focused approach, right? So for output-focused, it's usually done in a deductive approach, and that is the teacher will present some kind of grammatical rule, and then based on that rule, the teacher will give you some examples, and then you'll be asked to generate some examples, right? So this is a deductive process. However, in the inductive process, you first start with examples, and then you formulate a rule yourself, right? So this is more focused on input. They give you a lot of inputs, examples as inputs, right? And then you figure out the rule yourself. And then I also related these concepts to the difference between learning and acquisition, right? According to Krashen and other researchers. So I mentioned that deductive learning is more similar to explicit declarative learning, right? The conscious learning. And inductive is more similar to acquisition, implicit learning. However, I should clarify that there's not a strict separation, right? So not a solid line, but more like dotted line. Know that these are, first of all, these are all theories, right? They're all theories. They're just ways to explain how language learning works. But, you know, there's no, it's not like our brain is split in half, you know, with these two learning systems and they don't interact. It's not like that at all, right? Learning is actually very complicated. And so there's not a strict separation, but I'm just saying that the inductive approach reminds us of how acquisition works, right? So you start from the examples and you figure out the rule. And definitely you can learn inductively in the classroom environment as well, right? So the teacher can first give you some sentences and then you figure out the rule yourself very deliberately. Or in the self-study kind of scenario, for example, So here's the HSK4 standard textbook, lesson 5 on page 59. And the grammar point is 对来说, right? You might have studied this before. So deductively, if you learn this deductively, you will start with the rule, right? The rule says 对来说 indicates the angle from which matter is seen. For example, and then it gives you the example. So you start with the rule and then you go to examples, right? 对我来说，对一个女人来说，一杯水对一条小鱼来说，对一条大鱼来说, etc., right? And so you go, okay, so that means like for me, for a woman, for a little fish, for a big fish, right? You figure out these examples. So that's a deductive way. But the inductive way is that you start with the examples first, right? First you start with the sentences, right? And then you maybe ask ChatGPT to give you a translation, right? And then you see, okay, so for me, a clothes, this kind of clothes is not very important, etc., right? It's for me, and for a woman, beauty and smarts, they're all important, right? So you start with examples, and then you figure out, okay, I think 对来说, right? 对来说, that means probably it means something like for, right? And then you read the rule, okay, oh, okay, that's what it is. Right, so you can learn a grammar point in these two ways, deductively or inductively. So definitely during your self-study, you can learn it inductively, right? So you start from the examples and then you figure out the rules. So if you do this inductively, then is it implicit or is it explicit? What do you guys think? Right? If you study this inductively, you start from examples and then you figure out the rule. Is it implicit? Is it a kind of acquisition, or is it a kind of explicit learning? Right? Actually, it's a little bit of both, right? Because having learned the rule, like for example, if you have learned the declarative rule, 对来说 is for. Right? If you learn this rule, then having learned this rule will help you notice later on in the examples. For example, in a natural learning environment, in an informal environment, having learned this will help you notice how 对来说 is used in a natural context. For example, remember the story of Richard Schmidt that we mentioned last time, right? He is the linguist that learned Portuguese. Last time I didn't read this box very carefully, so this time I'm gonna just read this word for word, right? So that you can actually understand how he came up with this hypothesis. And so here under the heading, the advanced organizer argument, grammar instruction might also have a delayed effect. The researcher Richard Schmidt kept a diary of his experience learning Portuguese in Brazil. Initially, he had enrolled in formal language classes where there was a heavy emphasis on grammar. When he subsequently left these classes to travel in Brazil, his Portuguese made good progress, a fact he attributed to the use he was making of it. However, as he interacted naturally with Brazilians, he was aware that certain features of the talk, certain grammatical items, seemed to catch his attention. He noticed them. It also happened that these items were also items he had studied in his classes. What's more, being more noticeable, these items seemed to stick. Schmidt concluded that noticing is a prerequisite for acquisition. The grammar teaching he had received previously, while insufficient in itself to turn him into a fluent Portuguese speaker, had primed him to notice what might otherwise have gone unnoticed, and hence had indirectly influenced his learning. It had acted as a kind of advanced organizer for his later acquisition of the language. Right? So what's an advanced organizer? Well, advanced organizer is just a way of saying previews or warm-up, right? And in Chinese Zero to Hero, in our video courses, generally we have some kind of warm-up before a lesson, right? So that's a way to prime you, to help you recall what you know before about the topic. So Richard Schmidt is saying that learning grammar in the class is a kind of advanced organizer. It helps him to be primed to notice grammatical features for acquisition. right? So his informal learning is a kind of learning in itself, right? So even though it's a kind of acquisition, however, you can also consider that as self-study, right? So if you're listening to Portuguese and you're figuring out the rules, you're replaying your grammar lessons in your head, and you're figuring out the rules, even though it's inductive, but it's still a kind of learning in a way, right? So there's not a strict separation between the two, between acquisition and learning. So we can think of learning on the one hand, learning, right? Learning, one hand, and acquisition. We shouldn't think of them as like two separate things. Rather, we should think of them as some kind of continuum, right? So you can have an activity that's more leaning toward the learning side, and you can have an activity that's more leaning toward the acquisition side, or somewhere in between, right? So just remember that these theories, they're not absolute, so we shouldn't be too dogmatic about these, right? So again, in inductive learning, you start from examples, and these examples can appear in a textbook or a storybook, right? And these examples can also appear in the classroom, and examples can also appear naturally in your conversation, right? So grammar can be learned in many different ways, and it's a multi-stage process and not one single swoop, right? Language learning is never just, you do it once and then it's done, right? It's you have to approach the same item from many different angles, and you have to use many different approaches rather than believing these absolutes. Okay, I can only do it through input, or I should only do it through learning, right? You should have a more balanced approach, and we're going to touch on that in this lesson as well. All right, so that was grammar, and today we're going to move on to vocabulary. First, let's answer this question. Should vocabulary be learned incidentally in context, or do you think we should explicitly by rote learn them? What do you guys think? Do you think we should learn them primarily by reading books and looking at TV shows and listening to podcasts, or do you think we should learn vocabulary primarily by rote, explicitly? What do you guys think? Hi, Grafung Kartoffel, 你好. Yeah, let me know if you have any answers to that question. All right, so again, experts agree that language acquisition generally is a better idea, right? This is what the approach that most educators recommend. Raquel Coy says both. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, both. Sorry. And the reason is that the language is very complex, and language cannot be explicitly taught one item at a time, right? It's just not possible. For example, from this page in the teacher's manual, it says, without adopting an extreme position regarding the merits of either incidental learning or direct language instruction, research provides fairly incontrovertible evidence that ER, that is extensive reading, can indeed promote language development and literacy. In line with Goodman, Fries, and Strauss 2016, and Smith 1988, 2004, 2006, 2007, and Crash in 2004, notice that language is too complex to be deliberately and consciously learned one rule or item at a time. This argument, amplified in Crash in 2010, seems especially compelling with regard to English syntax, which is characterized by many orthographic and syntactic idiosyncrasies that even the most brilliant linguists struggle to describe, and which even literate, well-educated native speakers cannot always understand formally, right? The English lexicon, that is words, right, vocabulary in the dictionary, is also remarkably complex due to its diverse origins and dynamic history. There is simply too much complex linguistic information for learners to master consciously or intentionally under the typical time constraints that affect most L2 readers. So ER, that is extensive reading, naturally exposes readers to naturally occurring phrasal and clausal patterns, repeated and alternate uses of lexical items and their spellings, and a range of other graphological features such as paragraphing, punctuation, and capitalization conventions. Right? This page from the teacher's manual clearly states that in language is just simply too complex to be learned one item at a time, and you have to expose to different vocabulary items in a more natural context, such as reading or listening. And the Ellis and Shintani book also discusses the importance of learning words in context, and it says, quote, a simple list of words is not nearly explicit enough to constitute a syllabus. It is also necessary to consider the central patterns of a word's use and the combinations that a word can enter or enters into, right? So you need to take collocations into account, and you need to take syntax into account. For example, see is frequently inserted parenthetically into a statement to indicate concern. For example, you see, I was feeling lonely, right? So this see is not the same as the seeing with your eyes, right? Acquiring words like this, it needs context, right? So since words have so many meanings, acquiring them in a wide range of contexts is a much better approach. But having said that, learning from one approach is not a good idea, right? Learning by rote is also important, and it should not be discarded, right? We should never have the idea that language learning is one method alone, right? If anybody tells you, oh, language is all acquisition, and language is all reading, language is all just watch TV, or language, you should learn language this way, right? When you hear something like that, always be careful, because language learning is very complex, and it never works in just one way. All right, now let's talk about rote learning and why rote learning sometimes is important. So as Holtzian, this Dutch researcher in 2001 puts it, quote, this unqualified rejection of rote learning of information kept in the list format, however, may be unwarranted, right? So a rejection of rote learning may be unwarranted. For instance, suppose a learner has encountered some new vocabulary items in a meaningful reading or listening task and has done all of the following, right? The learner tried to infer their meaning, checked these inferences by consulting a dictionary, and listed the word forms along with other relevant lexical information in a personal notebook. It would then only be profitable for him or her to regularly consult that list and rehearse its contents, right? So if you read the book and you have learned many words, it's a good idea to review these words that you have learned, right, rather than to just let yourself forget it. Right. Let me check your comments. Else here says, I think learn from videos is more effective. Yeah, exactly. That's why we have language player, right? I'm going to talk about it later. And Sabine, he says, both. Yes, exactly. Bjorn says, ni hao. Hi. All right. Welcome to our live stream. I hope the information that we're going to present in the next 40 minutes are going to be very helpful to you guys. All right, so here's the testimonial of one Japanese language learner. And he also passed the same very difficult test N1, right? So that's his or her success story. So the learner said that they wrote new vocabulary items in a notebook and review them every day, right? So doing that and having this kind of discipline actually helped them pass the N1 exam, right? So it's not just reading alone, but it's deliberate learning and review. And in this 2003 meta-analysis on various vocabulary learning methods, the researcher Peter Gu concluded, quote, in fact, there is already evidence in recent studies of second language learners that a combined approach, or like you guys said, both, right? Both approaches, is superior to incidental vocabulary learning alone. And Zimmerman, 1994, remember Zimmerman from our first lesson, right? He advocated self-regulated learning, right? Zimmerman, 1994, for example, found that 3 hours a week of explicit vocabulary instruction plus some self-selected reading were more effective than reading alone, right? And the researchers Perry Bacht and Vesha, 1997, also found that reading plus explicit instruction led to superior gains over a period of 3 months, right? So a combined approach is proven to be better. So balance is needed, right? And while I was learning Japanese, I made a mistake of foregoing rote learning because I thought, oh, rote learning is boring. I'm just going to read, listen, and then I'll just naturally pick things up. But then it didn't turn out that well, right? Because my test score was quite low. So then I started more rote learning later on, which I'll describe. And later on in GoList 2003's paper, later on in the paper, it says the intentional and direct learning of vocabulary does not and should not rule out contextual learning, right? So learning by rule doesn't mean that you should not learn in context. In fact, learning new words from context might well be only the first step learners employ, and they should carry on with metacognitive choice of words and treatment to encode the new word together with the context where it appears. For example, remembering the word together with the surrounding sentence, right? So remembering words in context is very important, according to the GoList paper. And that is why in Language Player, we have this feature where if you look up a word, it can actually find the word in all different kinds of videos, like TV shows, movies, YouTube videos, etc. Right? So, for example, for the word 不耐烦, it found 500 videos across all kinds of genres, and you can see how 不耐烦 is used across across YouTube. Then, in the conclusion of GoList 2003 paper, he said, quote, being able to remember one meaning of a list of words within a week or so is easy. Developing a functional lexicon that contains morphological, semantic, syntactic, pragmatic, and emotional connections needs a gradual process that takes much more time and effort, right? So memorizing a list of words and their English translation and being tested 2 weeks later and still be able to remember the form, meaning, connection, it can be very easy, right? However, being able to use the same words in different contexts and be able to understand their meanings very accurately and also understand their pragmatic meanings. For example, how do you actually use it in an actual conversation, right? For example, when people say, how are you? They don't literally want to know how you are, but it's just a greeting, for example, right? And the emotional connections, the different nuances of words. So that's all information that will take much more time and effort. So we need various approaches. We need both contextual learning and rote learning, and also we need to learn with different modalities, right? You need to read and learn words in when you're reading, but at the same time you need to also pick up words auditorily, because if you don't, then you might run the risk where you can recognize a word on paper but not be able to recognize a word auditorily, right? So when people say something to you and you're like, oh, what are you talking about? But then if there's subtitles and you read the subtitles, oh, okay, that's the word I recognize, right? So that's a problem with modality, right? So when you lack auditory training, then you might not be able to recognize the word auditorily, and vice versa, right? So if you are a very good audio learner, then you might not be able to recognize the same word when it's in a written form, right? So you need to make sure that you develop a multimodal learning strategy. And as for myself, I use Language Player, which I spent many years to develop, and I use my Language Player application to save the new words and keep track of vocabulary that I learn daily. And this is a very early screenshot dated February 21st, 2025. So that's 2 months ago. I exported the list to Anki, and then I clear the list, right? So sometimes because having too many words in Language Player can slow down the application's performance. So from time to time, I'll export it all to Anki and then just clear the whole list so that I can start a new list, right? That's why it says only 417. In fact, although I've accumulated a much bigger number of words. And language player also lets me review the word in context by giving me lots of video examples, right? For example, this anime, right? So I was learning the word hakugai, meaning persecution, right? Not prosecution, persecution, hakugai, right? And then it gave me this context which I can play and learn the word in context. All right, so now we've established that we should review the words by rote. And now let's answer the question, what words should we review, or which words should you review, right? Should you review all of the words you come across in the text, or should you only select a few to review? What do you guys think? Do you guys, when you read, do you underline every word that you don't know and try to memorize all of them? Or do you underline them, look them up, but you only try to remember certain one of them? Or do you just forgo the whole process altogether? What do you guys think? What's your approach? For example, here's the frog in the well story from lesson 2, right? So when you see this, do you underline every word that you don't know and then try to memorize every single word? What do you guys think? Do you highlight everything that you don't know and then put them in the list and then memorize the whole list? Yeah, feel free to leave a comment anytime. I'll get to them. Right, so this text is a HSK 5 level test, right? So let's say that you save all the words and then your highlights will look like this, right? All of these words, Tiandi, Guangguang, they're all highlighted. And then you try to memorize all of them, right? That doesn't matter whether they're easy words or hard words or rare words or common words. So you memorize all of them. So what's the problem of this approach? Seppi Natty says content words. What do you mean by content words? So words that are not grammatical, like you skip the and you only memorize Lantian, for example. Is that what you mean? And Raquel Coy says, not every word. I try to encounter a word a few times before adding it to it. I said, okay, that's a good approach. Yeah, that's a good approach. So if you encounter a word a few times, then you know that that's a high frequency word, right? But the only problem with this approach is that sometimes you forget that you have come across this word before, right? So memory is it's not always reliable. But that's a good approach. Actually, that's what I used to do. Like I just come across a word a few times and then I save it. Excuse me. Let's see. And Nicole Wilson says, I will normally write them down and put into groups. I will study them gradually. Okay, good. Good approach. Sorry. And James S. Shaw says, if this is HSK, that's good. I know most of it. That's great. Sorry. Sorry, guys. All of a sudden, I started coughing for some reason. All right. So the problem with this approach, let me explain, right? The problem with saving every word and then try to remember every word is that you're just overwhelmed. Right? You might end up with a vocabulary coverage like this, right? So for example, you're at HSK 4 level, right? HSK 4 might have this many words, HSK 5 this many words, HSK 6 this many words, and let's say that this is conceptually all the relevant Chinese words that you want to learn. And then if you just read, and then you just save every word that you come across and you put them in a list, and your vocabulary might eventually end up like this. So you end up capturing a lot of really difficult words, but then you're ignoring a lot of other common words, right? So that's the issue. So ideally, you want to have a coverage something like this, right? You memorize the words in the yellow circle. And for the other words that you come across, then you sort of just treat them very lightly, right? You just look them up and then say, okay, I know the meaning, but it's too hard at this stage, and I'm just only going to focus on the more frequent common core words. And as your vocabulary grows, it grows bigger, and that circle grows bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And eventually at one point you can just forget the levels and go, okay, yeah, my vocabulary is good enough and I should just learn all the words. Right, so I'm almost at this point for Japanese, right? So according to my learning progress, after analyzing it, I project that by July 12th, or sometime around that time, right? Or maybe I can make it July 14th, right? It's the Bastille Day. It's an important day for the French. So July 12th, I'll be able to know most N1 words and move on to learn all the words, right? So that's a big milestone for me, July 12th. All right, so how can you focus on the core words? What are some approaches? Earlier, Raquel Coy says that she would keep reading, and if the same word if the same word appears many times over the course of a few days, for example, then she will review it. Then she will put that in the SRIs and review it. So that's one approach. Let me read your other comments. 陈星 says 一些单词我会记住，但是全部不记住啊，我中是记不住啊，是不会全部记住，是的。Yeah. All right. So one way is that in Language Player, you can go to your profile page and then set your level, your current level. For example, if you're HSK, you can just put if you're HSK 4, you can just put your current level under HSK 4. And once you set your level, you can then go to your settings and then turn on show phonetics and only for hard words, right? If you have these two settings turned on, then as a result, our system will then only label the difficult words for you, right? So once you see this, you understand that, okay, so I should focus only on the words that don't have pinyin on them. Okay, so I'm just gonna learn the words that I don't know that don't have pinyin on them, right? Once you go through the setting process, you pick your level and then you turn on show phonetics for only hard words, and now the system will only put pinyin on words that you don't have to know, right? So anything that has pinyin is optional. You can just skip the words with pinyin, or you can just look them up, right? Look them up, get the quick meaning, okay, and then just move on. So if I were HSK4, I would only say pa, right, to crawl, and 宽广 meaning broad, and then 一角 meaning a corner, and then 微笑 meaning to smile, right? So now my vocabulary load is much lighter, right? All right, now let's discuss how can words be reviewed and remembered, right? So how can we make sure that it sticks, right? Make sure that we won't forget. So what are some of your ways to remember words that you learn? So let's brainstorm, right? So what are some strategies that you guys employ for making sure that the words stick? So what are some of your strategies? Right? Do you just repeat them over and over again? Just say 微笑微笑微笑微笑 smile 微笑 smile 微笑 smile 微笑 smile 100 times. Or do you write them in the book 100 times, right? You write 微笑 smile, right? 微笑 smile 微笑 smile, right? What are your ideas? What are some of your strategies? Or you can think of connections, right? You can think way. Okay, this kind of sounds like way, right? Way. I don't know, the Shaw, it sounds like somebody named Shaw, right? So you might meet a person named Shaw on the way, right? So this is called a keyword method, by the way. It's by making connections with your L1, in this case English, right? And then you come up with keywords to help you remember the word. Now this is called a keywords method. So Adele says Anki space repetition. Wow, good one. I'm going to explain it later, right? Lutner says write it down, right? You write it down in the notebook or something. And James S. Shaw says just write a lot and say them as I speak. I also like to look at the etymology to make the etymology yeah, a very good strategy. Yeah, especially with Chinese, right? Because in Chinese, everything's made of Chinese characters, right? Everything's made up of components that have etymological origins. 陈星 says 用生词造句子效果有一点是吗？用生词造句 like make more sentences, although it can take time, right? And James S. Shaw says say them as I write. Multimodal, right? Multimodality. Raquel Coy says, I have to change my methods when I get bored. Sometimes writing the characters with the sample sentences by hand is good. Other times using the language player dictionary to see the word in context. That's great. Oh, great. Wow, you use language player. That's good. Very happy to hear. And yeah, our words in video context feature is a killer feature, right? Very few apps on the internet can do this and be able to do it to our extent, because we have a huge library with like 1 million videos, right? Everything indexed. So when you type in the word, and we'll give you like hundreds of examples, right? You're just overwhelmed with examples. All right. So now let's talk about some strategies that I came across. Okay. So you guys mentioned some really good strategies, but let's look at some strategies that language learners have came up with. So this guy, our friend Hermann Ebbinghaus, this German psychologist, right? He came up with the concept called the forgetting curve. Yeah, he actually measured how he forgot things. Actually, he mentioned, I think he did research on how he learned word endings or something. I couldn't exactly figure out how he came up with the curve, but this is quite commonly accepted in the second language acquisition literature. So according to his research in his data collection, right, he only tested on himself. He came up with these exponential curves where the strength of the memory fades with time, right? So after 1 day, it's like only half as strong, and after 2 days, it's like one quarter strong, right? You have this forget curve. However, if you review it on the second day, right? So after 1 day, you review it, and then you forget it slower, right? Then your forgetting is slower. And if you review it again the third day, then it's even slower, right? And the fourth day, it's even slower, right? So based on this theory, how do you guys think you should review your vocabulary? Raquel Koi says, and Anki. Yeah, I'm going to explain Anki later. Raquel Koi says, recently I've been getting into ChatGPT to create short stories. Oh yeah, that's good. Except for ChatGPT's short stories are kind of boring. I don't know. ChatGPT is not very creative. It's very sad to say. But maybe you can say, hey, ChatGPT, can you tell me a famous Chinese story? That's like, that's already been written before, and then you use this word. Maybe that can help better. Right. Okay, now let's move on. Here's one method by this YouTuber named David James. This video was uploaded in 2008, and he came up with this method called the GoldList. What's a GoldList? Well, basically, you write down a vocabulary list, and you call it a head list, right? You write all these items in a list, and then you wait for 14 days. You wait for 2 weeks, right? You let yourself forget, right? By the end of 14 days, you probably have forgotten most of them, right? And then you will delete everything that you remember, and then you copy the forgotten words into a new list, right? So here, ChatGPT made this infographic, which is very impressive, right? Except for this is wrong. It should be copy the forgotten words. Copy the forgotten words into a new list, and then you review this new list, and then you repeat, right? After 2 weeks, you delete everything that you remember, and you copy the new words into a new list, and then you repeat, right? So this is the GoldList method. Have you guys tried this? Has any of you tried this? No, yeah, I personally haven't tried this. I think this is a little bit time consuming. Also, what do you guys think is the problem with this approach? What do you think is the problem with the GoldList? You first write a list of words and you wait for 2 weeks. 2 weeks, right? 2 weeks. And then you copy the forgotten words into a new list and then repeat. What's the problem with this approach? Raquel Quay says, I've stopped. What? How come? What did you think about the GoldList method? Well, one disadvantage, obviously, is the 2 weeks wait, right? Because after 2 weeks, you've forgotten everything. And there's no immediate review. Remember the forget curve, right? After 1 day, you already have lost half of the memory, right? So it declines super fast in the first day, and then it declines more slowly in the subsequent days. Imagine if you go to 14 days later, like you have nothing left, right? It's better to review it sooner. This way you save more time, right? So you can capitalize on the fresh memory and make the memory stronger, right? That's one approach. 陈星 says 我试过很无聊的方法 so too tedious, right? Great. And another approach, and another problem with the GoldList approach is that it uses this concept called distillation, right? The problem is, if you remember the word after 2 weeks and you delete them, you think, okay, I've got them, I remember them, right? And you distill them. The problem is, if you recall them 2 weeks later, it doesn't mean that you won't forget them 4 weeks later or 8 weeks later, right? After 2 weeks, if you can recall them, you can still forget them later on, right? So that's a problem with distillation. So that's another problem. So there are pros and cons to this method, and also there's no really scientific validation to this that I'm aware of, and also it lacks efficiency. And now let's look at space repetition and how it works. So space repetition system, or SRS for short, it's basically a system where as soon as you start to forget, you review, right? And then a day later, you review again, right? So your memory just gets stronger and stronger and stronger as you do more reviews. And in the typical space repetition system, you also make the distinction between easy items and hard items. Easy items are things that you remember really well after a day. For example, after 1 day, right? And you remember it really, really well. Like, okay, so if that's the case, then I'm just gonna leave it for like 4 days, and then you're gonna review it again, right? And then if it's easy again, then you review it after an even longer period of time, right? So that's easy words. But if a word is hard, if after you review it for 1 day, say, that's a hard item, then you're gonna review it again. That's still hard, then you review it again, right? You just keep repeating it. So they makes a distinction between easy items and hard items. So why do you think that's a good strategy? So what do you guys think? Why do you think we should make a distinction between easy items and hard items, right? Why do we review easy items only after a long time and review hard items after a short time? Why do you guys think that's the case? Well, the answer is actually very simple, because it saves time, right? It saves time, because if you review easy items every day, that's not necessary, right? You're just wasting time. And then imagine, right? If you review 20 words every day, right? So after the first day, you will have another 20 new words plus the 20 words you've already learned the first day, right? And on the third day, you will have 20 words plus 20 and then plus 20, right? So it will just get more and more and more, and then eventually you end up having to review like thousands of words every day, right? That's not manageable. It's not practical. So that's why you review only the hard items, right, frequently, and then the easy items you just leave it for a longer period of time. This way that you can save a lot of time. Yeah. So that's the reason. And there's research that supports this approach, right? In this 2016 paper, 2 Russian researchers did tests on 22 young Marine cadets. One group had conventional homework assignments, and the other group used this piece of software called Linguatorium, a Linguatorium. And Linguatorium is basically a space repetition system, as you guys mentioned, right? And the difference is quite striking, right? The paper says, quote, based on the test results, the difference between vocabulary items considered fully learned by the adaptive tutoring model, the experimental group, that is the group using SRS, and the control group was almost threefold, right? So using SRS gives them like a threefold advantage, right? So use SRS, very important. And here's a testimonial from one Reddit user named Swaystar123, and he got 103 out of 180, right? So just a little bit better than my score. And he mentioned that he uses this website called jpdb.io. So this is a Japanese learning website, and it has a space repetition system built in. You guys are learning Chinese, so probably this is not very useful to you, but he uses this SRI system that's on the website. And he says, after I was done with Horimiya, I started Nisekoi. At this point, I discovered the JPDB MPV plugin. So that's interesting, right? MPV is a video player, and there's a plugin for the MPV video player that can automatically convert vocabulary items into the JPDB website's import format, right? And he says, which is a one-click sentence mining setup. In my opinion, this is the best and easiest way to mine sentence cards. I'm going to talk about sentence mining a little bit later. So he makes use of this very creative Japanese learning SRI system. And as many of you have mentioned already, a very popular SRS system is Anki, right? So how many of you actually use Anki? I myself use Anki. How many of you use Anki? If you use Anki, you can type 1 or something in the chat. Okay. Yeah, it's super popular, right? So this is a screenshot of my own Anki, right? So I have the word in a sentence embedded, and also for the reverse side, I have the pronunciation of the word and the intonation of the word plus English translation. Okay, SP says he uses Anki, and Raquel Coy also says that you use Anki. Great. So 2 of you, 2 out of 13. Great. So not too many, right? 2 out of 13. So you're not the majority. And with Anki, you can review the same word over and over again, and the review interval is extended longer and longer, right? And you can also choose whether it's an easy word. Kandang means easy, and seikai means correct answer, and muzukashi means hard, right? And moichido is again. Right? So really hard words, words that you get wrong, you just press moichido, or again. But if it's hard, you press this button, and then it will come up 6 days later. And if you press this seikai, or correct answer, you will get prompted 9 days later. And if it's kantang, or easy, then you will get reviewed, get prompted 14 days later, right? And yeah, so you can choose the interval based on how easy the word is. Why do you guys think that is? Raquel says, and migaku memory. Oh yeah, I've heard about. Yeah, I've heard about it. Migaku memory. So that's specifically for Japanese, right, Raquel? Yeah, the reason why we have these intervals is because it saves time, right? Imagine if you have to do mochido, or again every time for every word, then you're just going to be overwhelmed. So for example, today I learned 31 new words, and then I have to review 202 words. So this is the number of words I have to review, plus this is the number of new words that I've learned today. Right, so each day probably I go through. Today my review load is a little bit higher, but usually this number is more something like 150, 160, and this number is more like 40 something, right? So each day I learn something like 200 words, review plus new words, right? 200 cards. And as for me, I started using Anki only since February 15 this year, right? So not a long time. And I put in a total of 110 hours on Anki use alone. So every day I spend about an hour and 40 minutes, right? Just because I have so many cards to go through, just because I'm trying to really review all the words that I know and then expand my vocabulary, right? So I spend a long time every day on Anki. And also when I'm reviewing Anki, I'm also looking up the words and checking them in context, and also asking ChatGPT to compare words and help me understand the different nuances of words and different differences in shades of meaning, right? When you have very similar words, you want to be able to know the differences between them, right? And also learn them in context. So that can take a little bit of time too. So this number can be significantly less depending on your approach. You can just go like next, or you can go, what does that mean? And you look them up, right? And this is the stats that Anki has compiled. Oops, sorry. This is the stats that Anki has compiled about my words. So as you can see, I've learned a total of 3,620 words. And that's over 67 days. So it's about 50 cards per day. And there are 1,492 words that I have learned very well. So these are very well memorized words. And then I have 1,400 words that are less familiar. So I'm still in the middle of reviewing these words, right? So these are the words where it's mishu jokuki. Mishu jokuki. That means I haven't learned them well enough. And then the yellow part is kyushu, and that means these cards are stopped, right? So they might be cards that I've already got down, like these cards are completely memorized, or there might be some error in the card that I stopped them. And the blue slither right here, that is the shinkyu. Shinki means new ones, right? So that's the new vocabulary words. So in total, I have 3,620 words down. And here's another example. This Reddit user who got 179 out of 180, which I've mentioned every time throughout the past few episodes. So this Reddit user named Taira no Runemori, he mentions that he uses Anki to review kanji, meaning Chinese characters in Japanese, right? And then he says, by the time of the test, I was only spending a minute a day on Anki deck, right? And rather than my 1 hour and 40 minutes a day. He spends just minute a day, right? So he's super fast. Let me check your comments. Raquel says, Migaku supports a few languages, but not close deletion cards like Anki, I see. Chombi Stanford says, I am from Brazil. I love China. I joined the class by parachute. Oh, I speak little English, so I'm confused if this class is English or Chinese. If anyone can enlighten me, I would be grateful. For learning strategy, we generally use English to instruct. However, most of the learners here are learning Chinese, but these learning strategies will work across languages. For example, I was learning Japanese, right? I was relating my experience with learning Japanese, so it can definitely help you with learning any language like English. And Chelby says, sorry if I disturb the class with a question outside the proposed content, strength, and studies. No worries, just leave your comments, and if I can, I'll answer it at the end of the live stream. And SP says, Chinese class taught partially in English. Oh, I see. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, because this is a learning strategy class, for the comfort of everyone, I use English. But for grammar classes or vocabulary classes, for the higher levels, I'll use Mandarin, right? Okay, so this very successful learner who got near perfect on the hardest Japanese test, and he went from 0 to N1 in 17 months, right? And he uses Anki. And he also mentions that he regretted not having sentence mining. He says, regrets, I didn't sentence mine. What's sentence mining? Well, sentence mining is quote, capturing or mining learned words and grammar points from real sentences, so for example, anime lines or news articles, and turn them into flashcards for regular review using SRS such as Anki. Right? So basically, it's learning words in context, and then, for example, you can use Language Player to learn words from videos or learn words from text, and then you import that into Anki, and then you review the words in their original context. So for example, I learned the word hakugai. Actually, this is a screenshot for donata, right? So now I'm reviewing this donata word in the original context, along with the video clip where I saved the word from, and then the backside is the definition of the word, right? So now Language Player allows you to export words into Anki flashcards, so you have the best of both worlds. You can learn the words in context with videos, with rich context, and then you can use something like Anki to help you learn them by heart. Right? So now video clip can show up on Anki decks as well. Right? So when you export the words from Language Player, you will now get a column called Anki front and Anki back, right? Anki front and Anki back, 2 additional columns in the CSV you export. And then when you import it, it will import into Anki in this kind of format. Right? You have the context sentence, you have the word you are learning bolded with the video clip you save the word from, and then in the backside, you have the pronunciation of the word and the definition of the word, and as well as the level information of the word, right? So you have best of both worlds, right? You can review the words in context. I didn't have this ability before I took the N1 test. Yeah, so when I took the N1 test, I didn't code this yet. Later on, when I was reviewing my learning strategies, and I realized, oh, I wasn't learning words very well, right? I wasn't using Anki at all. So later on, I developed this feature so that now Language Player can export into Anki along with the original context, and that is super helpful. So later on, I'm going to make a tutorial video to show you exactly how to do this. Okay. Any questions? SB says, I have trouble using Anki for learning new words I've never seen before. I never remember them. For me, it's better for reinforcing cards I've seen elsewhere. I learned unique context to remember. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what we've been saying, right? Words need context to have meaning. Now let's talk about how not to learn vocabulary. Okay, so first, don't learn them from frequency lists. What do I mean by that? Well, frequency lists are lists like this, right? So these are the most common Chinese words in a big Chinese corpus, right? 的, 是, 了, 意, 在, 和, right? These are the most commonly occurring words. Some people say that, oh, just like learn frequency words, learn the top 100 words, and then you're good. Right? Some people say that, but what do you think is the problem with this approach? What do you guys think? Well, here's one objection to frequency lists, right? So from the Ellis and Shintani book, they said Sinclair and Renouf, 1988, however, argued that a lexical syllabus must consist of much more than the list of the most frequent words. They point out that it is necessary to consider not just the frequency of word forms, but also word meanings. For example, the word certain can mean specific, as in certain circles, or sure, as in I'm not very certain about that, right? With the former meaning accounting for 60% of the occurrences in the co-build corpus, and the latter only 18%. They also point out that because the most frequent forms are function words such as the, and to, right? It is important to also include lower frequency words in the beginner level course. Right? So imagine if you are a beginner, like you're new to Chinese, okay, I'm gonna learn all of these frequent words, but like, what does le even mean? Like, it doesn't even make sense to you, right? If you're just a beginner trying to learn le. What do you guys think about frequency lists? Have you ever tried to memorize a frequency list? Okay, hopefully not. So it's not a very effective approach. And another widely misused approach is to learn vocabulary in what's called lexical sets. For example, have you ever seen infographics like this? What do you guys think about What do you guys think about the effectiveness of using infographics like this to remember words? Do you think this is a good approach? Do you think this is effective? Just memorize all the fruits, right? Apple is ringo, banana is banana, orange is orange, strawberry is ichigo, grapes is budou, okay? And mango is mango, watermelon is suika, right? You go over the whole list, you memorize all of them. What do you guys think? Do you think this is a good approach? Do you think you can remember all of them and use them? Or do you think this is a waste of time? Or do you think it's a little bit of both? Or do you think this might help some people and this might not be effective for some people? What do you guys think? Nicole Wilson says it didn't work for me. Yeah, I rarely use something like this. Yeah, when I visit supermarkets in Japan, sometimes I take a look at the names of the items and I try to learn it that way, But I wouldn't learn things in such an encyclopedic way. As says, I kind of like it sometimes, like learning all the words with May. Okay, learning words with similar forms, right? This is lexical sets. This is talking about learning words with similar meanings. But yeah, that's an interesting approach. So learn words with the same morpheme, or learn words with the same etymology, or learn words with similar component, so you can differentiate and relate words across all the words that you know, right? So that's an interesting approach. Maybe that's helpful too. The problem with learning these lexical sets is that, according to this teaching manual, is that research suggests that this approach is ineffective. As this book summarizes, quote, one of the key issues is whether or not to teach words in lexical sets. For example, apple, pear, banana in a fruit set. Interference theory, Anderson 2003, Batley 1997, suggests that teaching words in the lexical will not be effective. The theory assumes that as similarity increases between targeted information and other information learned either before or after the targeted information, the difficulty of learning and remembering the targeted information also increases, right? So the more similar they are, the harder it is to learn. In other words, it will be easier to learn a set of unrelated words than a set of semantically related items, right? So it concludes that memorizing similar words together may lead to confusion rather than acquisition, right? However, if you already know most of the words in a set, then it might be helpful, right? For example, here it says Papa Thanaseo 2009, however, suggested that it might depend on the proficiency level of the learner. If the learner had no prior knowledge of words in a semantic set, they were likely to experience problems in learning them. However, if they already knew a number of the words, then they would be able to add the new words to the existing store, right? So for example, for me, I already know most of the words. So, infographic like this actually helps a learner like me at this stage, right? So I can learn how to say fig. Okay, I didn't know how to say fig. Oh, ichijiku. Okay, ichijiku is fig. Okay, ichijiku is fig. And then I might use language player and look at examples of ichijiku, how it's word used, and then add them to an Anki deck. However, remember we mentioned this, right? This concentric circle, right? You want to focus on the more frequent, the core words first, and then you want to deal with the rest of the words later as you get better, right? So with this set, with this fruit set, some of them are very frequently used, like apple, banana, right? But fig, unless you're in the Middle East, it's not frequently used, right? Like sometimes you see it in supermarkets, but it's not the thing that Japanese people would buy the first thing they go into a supermarket, right? They might go for something like strawberry, right? Or a watermelon or something like that. So try to memorize all of them without consideration of their frequency is probably not the best use of your time. It might be a good idea to just go over them and like, okay, so apricot is anzu. Okay, I didn't know that. Anzu or apricot, right? Or you can say, oh, coconut is yashi. Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, yashi. It's also called coconuts, or maybe it's pronounced differently. Papaya or lychee. Okay, so that's similar. I might just, out of interest, think, oh, okay, I didn't know these words before. Okay, that's interesting. But I wouldn't put them all into Anki decks and then try to use spaced repetition to remember all of them, regardless of their frequency, right? So I would keep frequency in mind. I would keep my language learning goal in mind first, right? And learn the most important ones first, and then I move on to the more obscure items like figs in Japanese. Okay. All right, so that's everything that I have to say about learning vocabulary. Do you have any questions? Do you have any comments, any objections? Please feel free to leave it in the comment section and I'll answer them like right now. If not, you can leave a comment later on in under the video, and I'll answer it in the next few days before my next live stream. Okay, so these are my references. There are 3 pages. All right, let me take a look at your comments. So Esp says, I kind of like it sometimes, like learn. Oh yeah, okay, I already read that. All right, so that's everything I have to say for vocabulary learning. Hopefully I didn't miss anything important. Right? Do you guys have any important questions that maybe I didn't cover before I end the live stream? Nicole says, I'm going to try a different approach from what you have recommended. What approach are you thinking of, Nicole? So in the next live stream, we're going to talk about production, that is speaking and writing, right? Because language learning is not just about input, and you also have to focus a little bit on output, right? Because if you don't practice how to speak, and when the time comes when you need to speak, and you'll be like, oh, I don't know how to say it. And that can be a problem, right? So next time we're gonna focus on production and how we can make sure not to neglect production. Nicole says, I have too many times trying to learn everything all at once, including frequency lists. Oh, interesting. Yeah. All right. If you have no more questions, I'll end this live stream and I'll see you guys next time. Thank you all for joining, and hopefully you have learned something from this live stream. All right, take good care.